topic of today. This photo is also booked, and it's a really nice photo that I think tells a story of often what goes on in these government crises, presidential interruptions or breakdowns. It's a photo from a street in Buenos Aires, and it says "Que se vayan todos." And it has also depicted the pots and pans on the left, down on the left there. So the point is, these are different sceneries than we saw earlier in the series. The military elites and the military is removed from the scene, and in comes civil society, mobilization from the streets, protests, trying to remove not only, or at least in some cases, not only the president, but they're saying "que se vayan todos." Congress as well. In Argentina in 2001, it was not only De la Rúa they wanted out. They also blamed the political elites in general. So the new type of crisis we see do not end democracy. Actually, a prerequisite, a condition for these crises is that some sort of democracy exists. Often they are the result of scandals, and you need a free media or relatively free media to discover these scandals. You need organization in civil society, so you need some sort of freedoms. So democracy is actually required for us to have these types of new crises, and we see a lot of them in Latin America, or we've seen a lot of them in Latin America. A first take on a comparison between these concepts, these phenomena, are to look at the actors, whether or not the incidents are constitutional, whether a new government is formed or a new regime is formed. So earlier we had the coups that ended in full democratic breakdown. Military actors or police actors, at least non-civilian actors, were central in removing governments. If we look at the more later crisis, at least with the exception of Honduras and Ecuador, and I might come back to those in the end if there is time, predominantly civilian actors have been the biggest threats for government, not military actors or police. If you look, are these events constitutional? Of course, a coup, the military would often say that they intervened in politics to save the constitution, but still most observers would argue this was not constitutional, what happened in Chile or what happened in Uruguay, Argentina, and many other countries. In the case of presidential interruptions or breakdowns, it depends on the procedure. So some might be constitutional, some might not. In all instances, there is a new government formed, with the sole exception of the phenomenon of autogolpes in Latin America and other places we're seeing where a president intervenes to take down Congress in order to secure himself in power. There's not a new government, but there is a regime change. In these later events, we'll see that, of course, democracy or electoral democracy survives the crisis. So in earlier writings I've compared them to standard governmental changes in Europe, where you have parliamentary regimes. We also see civilian actors, but more elites than actors from below. They are constitutional, there's a new government, but you do not get a new regime. So this phenomena of presidential interruption places itself somewhere between the totally unconstitutional coup and the more traditional form of changing government in parliamentary system between elections. Today I'll talk about democratic breakdowns or coups vis-a-vis the types of presidential interruptions we've seen. But first, I'll just briefly go through development of democracy in Latin America, because what we see in Latin America is a period of historic stability of democracy that has never been experienced in the region before. This shows the number of democracies, and when I say democracy, I just use a minimal requisite for democracy. There should be some sort of free elections. I do not put anything more into that as it is. So you have the number of democracies which vary, but we'll see it from the mid-1980s. It reaches its highest point ever, and it stays way beyond any point in post-World War II history, with some minor variation that records what's happened in Peru and so on. But almost all countries today in Latin America are democracies, at least minimally defined, and they've been so quite some time now. There is no great reversal. So Latin America is experiencing its longest extended period of democracy and its broadest experience of democracy in terms of inclusion of countries in this way. So we have, comparatively speaking at least, a historically stable democratic period in Latin America. Now this is from Freedom House, and this is just to show that, well, green here is what they call a fully free regime, and the yellow is half free, and purple is authoritarian. Just to show a comparative picture. You also see here Latin America is totally green or yellow in their definition. It looks almost like Europe, actually. And compared to other regions, Latin America is doing quite well. You'll see here in their coding, you'll see that all of the regimes in Latin America, of course, are some sort of democracy, with the exception of Cuba. This is quite historic. And not only that, as I showed on the previous map, we'll see that up to the left there is America. Just one country, 3% of the country is not electoral democracy. Compare that to other regions, that is Asia Pacific. Compare that to other regions outside of Western Europe, Latin America is doing extraordinarily well. In Sub-Saharan Africa, 1/3 of the countries are authoritarian. You see the same thing in Central and Eastern Europe or former Soviet Union. 1/3 of the countries are authoritarian. 20% in Asia Pacific. And of course in the Middle East, 80%. So, looking at world region outside Western Europe, Latin America is doing extraordinarily well. So we see here a unique period actually of democratic stability. Of course there are, and you all know this, loads of other issues to discuss, but in terms of electoral democracy, historic stability. Now, this is a graph that shows the, again, broad strokes. The red one here is the average of inflation over time, and this is the average of growth, blue. It is actually remarkable that democracy was established and survived in the 1980s. If we go back and consider the lost decade in Latin America, you see the average of the probability of a breakdown